the Grappling with podcast. Dr. Chris Hardy and William Walker will take a deep dive into topics covering wellness and prevention, performance, recovery, and injury management. Our mission is to provide the latest science-based information to help you get the most out of your grappling journey, both on and off the mats, and help you overcome any challenges you may be grappling with. Dr. Hardy is a licensed physician and BJJ practitioner, but the contents of the podcast are meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. Please seek out personalized care from your own medical provider prior to implementing any medical treatment or intervention.
Awesome. What's up, Bill?
What's up? Not much, actually. I do got something, though. Let me just jump right in. I need to tell you, and you over there,
okay,
the circus, that I had multiple people come up to me and thank me because they learned something last podcast.
What, not to drink urine?
No, absolutely not.
that urine doesn't cause scurvy.
They learned about scurvy, and
Nice.
they understand scurvy. And I'm just saying I'm here for the people. And you guys can both piss off.
They needed to thank you.
They
for
came
that.
up to me.
They, not Chris,
No.
who explained what scurvy
No one
was.
came up
you.
to Chris. Me. Because it comes down to the person that poses the question. Okay?
Does it?
I'm going to give you full credit. The urine question was fantastic.
Thanks.
So, yeah.
It
That's
wasn't a
all.
urine question. It was a scurvy question.
Well.
Urine was just a part of it. So
As is most of the podcast.
most of the podcasts, yeah, in my life.
Excellent. Do you have anything else?
That's it.
Well, that's good. That's good feedback. I'm
had
glad.
a Reese's Pieces earlier, so I'm feeling
You're feeling excellent. Well, speaking of eating, I got a little fired up, and you probably know I called you. I'm like, hey, we're going to do this podcast today.
Yeah, you put this in front of some other ones.
I sure did.
You were
I
ramped
even
up.
pushed my wife off a week, what she was fine with.
Yeah.
But, so, I'm trying to stay up to date with, what's being put out to the public and public health. And being a public health doc, it's probably important for me to do that. And I never got around to reading the 2021 Dietary Guidance to Improve Cardiovascular Health from the American Heart Association. It came out in November. And quite frankly, it pissed me off. So, because they're doing the same kind of nonsense. And what I thought we would do, instead of just sitting here and just kind of hacking at this this guidance here, is use it as a springboard for generalized nutrition topics. To tell how I think about it, and when I talk about it, how I base some of my opinions, and some of what we're going to get into is some of the problems with nutrition science in general. And so if we can talk to people how to, when they hear something, where it's coming from and how to formulate their own opinions is a lot better, because there's so much, you probably know, there's so much conflicting information.
Yeah.
You hear it all the
It's
time.
Confusing.
It's super confusing, and it doesn't do the public any good. And so, for instance, how many times have you guys heard one year eggs are good, and then eggs are bad, or coffee is good,
The
or
middle of
coffee's
eggs are bad.
or the middle of eggs are bad? These little, and
The yolk?
yeah, well, my point is, though, you hear about that all the time, and there's conflicting, and like, well, we'll make up your mind, and you're like, well, where's this all coming from? Or does everything we eat cause cancer? How many times have you seen something like,
Well,
this
it's kind of the joke, right? Is that wine will cause and chocolate will cause cancer, but they'll actually cure cancer over time.
right?
And it just goes back and forth.
Yeah, and it's a real problem. And I think what I'm going to do today, the first part of this, is tell everyone how these things are formulated and why we're getting such conflicting information. First of all, because people are like, I don't know what to believe anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So the bottom line is there's a problem with nutritional research first. And please, as I talk through this, kind of, just jump right in if you have a question on it. So nutrition research in general is almost entirely observationally based. And they use these tools, and the scientific term is memory-based dietary assessment methods. In other words, like questionnaires, surveys, and interviews. What did you eat last month? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Could you say,
That's how they develop. So questionnaires like that.
Yeah.
Like these are questions they would do to develop.
Like, Bill, how much red meat have you eaten in the last month?
Oh my gosh.
But you know what I mean?
Sure.
And so and we know that human memory is extremely fallible.
Right.
Anyway. And they're using these things as the basis for a lot of these observational, what we call epidemiological studies with nutrition. They're because, human memory and recall is suspect at best. It just is. We know that. So does that mean that kind of, when you see an observational or epidemiological trend, like, oh, we're seeing an association with eating this and maybe this disease, that doesn't mean it's causal. It doesn't mean it definitely causes it, but it may make you generate a hypothesis that could be later tested, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but the problem is they're taking these observational studies and either they're doing it, the authors are reporting it in language that is considered like it's, oh yeah, well, this is what's happening, like a causal statement, and or the news media grabs onto it and then makes what maybe just a weak association seem like that it's definitely causes this. So the problem with all these questionnaires is, like, if I ask you a specific thing, like let's just say the red meat thing, well, does that say what else you ate with that red meat?
Mm-hmm.
So there's these things called confounders. Kind of the classic thing we learned in public health training when we look at epidemiologic data is it's the coffee causes cancer. Okay, let's say we did a study and we asked people how much coffee they drink over how many years. And they would say, oh, I'll estimate it based on whatever they can remember, whatever their habit was. Then they take all those people and they look down the line as, well, how many of these people develop lung cancer? Let's say, I'm just making this up.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh, wow, a significant amount of coffee drinkers have developed lung cancer. Okay. And so then they could run with that and like, well, coffee causes lung cancer. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It's for what you know about physiology. But if you then look deeper into it and had other little data points is, well, how many of these coffee drinkers smoke? Well, we could make and look at the data in a different way and say, hey, people that drink coffee were also more likely to smoke. So that smoking is called a confounder. So the association in this case wouldn't necessarily be coffee causes cancer. This case, it would be coffee drinkers were more likely to smoke, and smoking is very well established as a causal mechanism for causing lung cancer. So those confounders are filled. I mean, if you can imagine when we're doing a questionnaire based on one type of food, you can imagine all the other things that go into that potentially are confounders, and you can't control for all of those things. And so, you can also skew data with whatever statistical method you can make. You can make pretty much anything look good or bad on these type of things, depending on how you kind of crunch the numbers.
Isn't there also issues where, like, let's say like the nut industry is like, oh, we want them to do a study on how macadamians are really healthy to eat for breakfast. And then they pay scientists to do this study and a lot of times want it to be leaning in their favor.
Of
and
course.
Then a headline comes out, macadamians, if you eat 2 ounces every day, you're going to have, a longer life.
Well, which is impossible to say, right?
Yeah.
You could correlate things at best. Correlation doesn't mean causation, but you're right. There's also those biases implicit into, funding issues and things like that. Well, it's such a problem in nutritional research, and we've known about it for years. I mean, there's what I'm holding up in my hand. You guys don't need to see this, but this is back from 2015 when these same guidelines, these guidelines come out, every 5 years or so. Mm-hmm. And back at that time in 2015, there's this whole paper here talking about this very same issue. There's plenty of papers talking about why this approach, you can't use these memory-based methods to make any kind of, you're basically basing your whole argument on a house of cards that just crumbles because of, just it's an awful way to gather data. But despite these kind of review articles and, other scientists saying, hey, why are you guys doing this? It doesn't make any sense. They keep doing the same thing. And when I saw this new thing that came out in 2021, it's like rehashing the same thing over time. And it's like,
do they come out with this every year?
So no, they don't. Typically, I'd have to look at, I know there's the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. This is a separate statement by the American Heart Association for Cardiovascular Health. So this is kind of an intermittent one, but every 5 years they do a Dietary Guidelines for America, which has the same kind of nonsense in it, and they're using the same kind of data. And
if you were to guess, why?
Well, I think there's several reasons for that, and there's also what I'll talk about here in a little bit is this paper here. This is from 2017 from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine, and they're talking about they need to redesign the process for establishing guidelines, the nutritional guidelines for Americans, and they go through potential reasons why. Some of them are people that have get into these committees. They've made careers out of publishing on these observational data. They have tenured faculty positions. And when people have had a whole career of doing something and making certain statements, it's really hard for them to say, oh, wow, everything I've published in the last 20 years is completely wrong, or not, a significant amount. So there's that human nature factor of it. They always say, it's a pretty dark comment, but in the scientific circles, they say, scientific advancement happens one funeral at a time. And what they mean by that is like that old guard is not going to change their mind, even in the face of.
Is that defeat like what scientists are built on? And
the scientific method. But that's what happens when ego and funding come in, right? You've built a whole reputation and publication record based on this. You become a quote unquote expert, and then the more you publish, the easier it is to get grant approvals then fund your own, basically fund part of your university. There's a lot of money tied up in all that. There's also, Olivia brought up previously off air about who's funding these studies, right? Or are there people on the board here from that have a vested interest in making sure processed food manufacturers right? And those lobbies are incredibly powerful. So you just have to start wondering why, like you said, did they keep putting this stuff out in the face of some obvious shortcomings in this? In this paper in 2017 from the National Academies of Science basically called them on the carpet. This is 2017, but they still did it. Right. And so there's a inner circle of these people that do this thing. And a lot of the things they come up with, their analysis is not then peer reviewed. It's almost like this own incestual thing. Yeah. And they don't have a lot of external subject matter experts that do their own reviews to contribute either. So it becomes this very incestuous type of thing. And it's hard. It's like a groupthink thing too. It's hard for someone then to raise their hand, like, "Hey,
as you explain it, it sounds fairly obvious. Like it seems kind of plain as day. Like there's other committees that are saying this method is ineffective,
right,
and actually is detrimental.
Yep,
which I'm sure we'll go into.
Yep,
but. So there's multiple committees that will say that and have proof and all that, and they maintain their methods. Who's the governing body for the Heart Association?
People think that's some official government organization. It's not. So Olivia, you could put a link. I'm sure you can do some research into some origins of the AHA and other government not government organizations, organizations such as them, and it's really squirrely when you look at it. Yeah. But, I think there's a bunch of stuff on YouTube that actually go through the history of it, and people should look into that stuff themselves. They're not a government organization. Now,
and that's why they don't have to necessarily listen to these other committees.
Well, but even the government, even the Dietary Guidelines from America, put Health and Human Services, U.S. Department of Agriculture related to this stuff.
Certify it or whatever.
Well, they're the ones putting out this the Dietary Guidelines from America that looks almost exactly like these recommendations. So there's problems in the whole thing, and this is a really interesting little snippet from 2018 from Journal of the American Medical Association by John Ioannidis. He's an MD, PhD from Stanford, and I'm going to quote some of the stuff in his paper. The first paragraph is perfect. He says, some nutrition scientists and much of the public often consider epidemiologic associations of nutritional factors to represent causal effects that can inform public health, policy, and guidelines. However, the emerging picture of nutritional epidemiology, which is what we were talking about, is difficult to reconcile with good scientific principles. The field needs radical reform. And he even goes on to say that nutritional research may have adversely affected the public perception of science in general. Like, they don't know what they're talking about because they contradict themselves all the time, right? And so it's not like I'm alone in the wild here. So it's a real problem that's been identified, but it continues to happen. So, but I'd like to kind of continue in this vein, kind of going back to these specific things. So what I'm going to do is actually use these dietary guidelines that were put out, the 2021 Dietary Guidance to Improve Cardiovascular Health. This is a very specific one from the American Heart Association. And they say it's a scientific statement from the American Heart.
This just came out at the end of
This came out in November 2021 and was published in December 7th, 2021 in Circulation, which is
fresh.
It's pretty fresh.
Off the press.
Yeah, and I saw it pop up and I was like, oh, it's going to be the same old, same old. I was hoping it wouldn't be, and I looked at some of the authors. I'm like, they're the same folks. I'm not going to name any of them. It's very evident if you look through this stuff. They're on these committees that put this out. So what I thought I would do, they have a bunch of what they call features. So those are parts of their recommendations, and they have 10 of them. I'm not going to go through and pick apart all 10. We would be here for hours. And what I'm going to do for this whole series of lectures is pick out a feature, talk about why I think they got it wrong, and then also in the process kind of tell you, kind of the basic science behind this, what I think about it, based on the research I've done, both for the book I wrote in 2015, which I did a whole lot of research for. Go ahead. Oh, she wasn't on. I was waiting for her to hit it. There we go.
Hey.
I'm so slow.
That's okay. But I'm referencing it on purpose because I did a whole bunch of research for 2.5 years before I did that. And that was 7 years ago. Things haven't really changed as far as what they're recommending because I was, lamenting it back then. So what I thought I would start out with today was what I thought was a pretty egregious one that people hear about all the time. Here's what their recommendation. Feature 5. Use liquid plant oils rather than tropical oils, animal fats, and partially hydrogenated fats. So before I get into the first two, the partially hydrogenated oils, we'll talk about that later. I actually agree with that 100%. Those are bad things. We'll talk about what those are later. But the first two, people hear this all the time. What do they say? Saturated fat.
It's horrific.
Yeah. What do they say about
it? Clogs your heart.
Clogs your heart. Yeah. What is
arteries.
that? Yeah. It's actually preposterous. It does no such thing. And they recommend replacing that with polyunsaturated fats in the place of saturated fat. So before we even get into that, it's really important because otherwise it's going to be Chris saying, no, this isn't good, and they're wrong, and they're going to say, no, everyone else is wrong, right? I like to go back to first principles in chemistry. You guys might want to turn the podcast off. I'm going to try to make it interesting, though, because it's really important, because if I don't, we're going to be back to the same thing. He said, she said, you're right, I'm wrong. So I like to break it down because I'm a former biochemist. I like to break it down from the chemistry aspect first.
If you just turn it into a song, we'll all be good.
That'd be if you can make, I will. If you write the lyrics, I'll write the music.
Okay.
We can do it. So what are fats anyway? So really when they talk about fat, they're basically things called fatty acids, and they're basically long chains of carbon with varying amounts of hydrogen in them. And I'll explain how this works. So a little bit of chemistry, and don't groan too bad, but a carbon atom has some electrons it can share. And the way we form bonds with other molecules is we share electrons. It's called a covalent bond. You don't need to know that, but that's the way that it links things up. Think of the old Lincoln logs, right? Mm-hmm. How we're connecting things. Bonds are the connectors, and they're basically electrons you're sharing with one another. So a carbon think of it as 4 arms. It can share 4 spaces on its atom. So it can connect to 4 things. If you think about the Lincoln log, it's basically, you can think of it as a circle with 4 sticks sticking out, mm-hmm. where it can connect 4 things. So when we make a whole chain of those, and this is where a visual would be really, really helpful, but when we chain those out, a carbon linking to another carbon basically uses a bond, a piece. So we have, at the very end, we have 3 other bonds that we could make. But in the chain itself, if you think about how they're chained together, here a carbon, there's a bond on the left connected to another carbon, the bond on the right connected to another carbon. So those 2 are taken up, and we have 2 left on the outside to bond with something else during the chain. Now, if I fill all those available bonds on this whole chain, and oh, by the way, the number of carbons is what makes the fats different. But if I fill up all those available bonds on the whole chain with hydrogens, which hydrogen atoms can bond with one thing, so it's perfect. So they'll fit. They're like, oh, here's a bond. I'm going to fit right onto it. If I fill up all those bonds with the hydrogen, that's called saturated. So that means I've saturated that chain with hydrogens. That's all a saturated fat means. Okay. Does that make sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
I'm oddly on the train still. I have not followed.
I love it. This is great. So
Mr. Baroni would be so stoked. That was my high school biology teacher.
Yeah.
It's amazing you remember their name.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
He was dope.
Well, chemistry is actually cool because it helps explain a lot of stuff. So the number of carbons in the chain make the different types of saturated fat. Another thing that's really just, God, irks me to no end is people just use saturated fat like it's this homogeneous thing, like it's just one thing. It's not. I mean, if you look at, I have, there's depending on the carbon length, they have very, very different biological activities. And I am going to give you an example. So saturated fats go from, like 4 carbons, which is called butyrate or butyric acid. So
I've heard of that.
Butyrate. And I'll talk about the different things in a minute. But just to give you an example, how many different types of these things are. And again, they're different because of how many carbons they have. So butyrate is a 4-carbon chain. So 4 carbons linked together. And they're classified, we classified saturated fats as short chain, medium chain, and long chain. So the 4-carbon butyrate is a short chain, and it's in dairy foods, major source, but it also is produced by our gut bacteria. So our gut bacteria ferment fiber we eat, and it changes it into butyrate. Butyrate's a saturated fat. It's also the primary fat that colon cells live on. Matter of fact, more colon cancers are produced when people are deficient in butyrate. So is that a bad saturated fat? It's a bit, it's a beneficial one.
Yeah. But you can go too far with them.
Well, like anything else, right? You would not just you. And the whole point is, fats are eaten in together. You don't get a whole can of butyrate and eat it, right? They're in a.
You don't know me.
Oh, that's true.
I'll butter my toast.
Well, butter has a bunch of other fats in it too, but that's just a component of it. We call that a food matrix. In other words, we don't eat any of these nutrients in isolation. They're all part of, they're eating together, and they interact and they do all kinds of things. So, studying them in isolation is, doesn't make any sense from a nutrition perspective. So they all have different biologic activities. Here's another example. Lauric acid. It's a medium chain saturated fat, coconut milk and coconut oil. So, if you go into, I'll reference, gosh, I hate doing this. I'm going to get tinged by you guys, but in the book here.
What book is this?
This is my book. So lauric acid, first point, 6% of fat in breast milk. It has antibiotic actions. It's an alternate fuel source for the brain. People with Alzheimer's, medium chain triglycerides can actually be broken down and used as an alternate fuel source by neurons, and it's shown to help people that are having dementia. So it increases HDL, lipoprotein, which is people think of as good cholesterol. It's not. We'll talk about that next week, because I'm going to make some statements today about cholesterol and saturated fat that I'm going to back up next week, okay? I don't have time to go into it right now. We're going to have to spend a whole podcast doing that.
You better bring a lunch then.
I know. So it also, they've shown that it actually can aid in weight loss too, by the way, that the medium chain triglycerides are processed differently than the long chain ones. And so triglycerides are basically just 3 fatty acids linked together. So I'll use that term too, okay? So, coconut oil is a source of that. So again, that's a saturated fat.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and another one like stearic acid. It's a long chain, 18 carbon. It's one of the saturated fats in red meat. And if you look at some real quick ones,
that's when we hear
a
lot of negative about.
Well, we're going to talk about that is the biggest bunch of nonsense, because that's all they have against red meat, right? Is it's saturated fat. By the way, up to 50% of fat in red meat is monounsaturated, oleic acid too, which is in olive oil. So it's not just this big thing packed full of saturated fat. It has all kinds of stuff. It has polys too, polyunsaturated fats as well. So stearic acid, I'm just showing you these are different things. They're not just all lumped together as saturated fat. It can reduce blood clotting. It doesn't promote inflammation like if it's in fat cells. In laboratory setting, it's triggered the death of breast cancer cells.
This is the
stearic acid, which is an 18 carbon saturated fat.
So there's a long chain.
Yep. Like beef, especially grass-fed beef, is a really good source of it. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. That's a really important point. When they use saturated fat as this one substance, it's not. They all have different biological activities. So next, so we've talked about saturated fat, how it's a chain where all the little extra bonds that are available are filled with hydrogens. What happens if you don't fill all those little bonds with hydrogens? So that's what's unsaturated. In other words, it's not completely filled with hydrogens. That's all unsaturated means.
Right.
And there's types of unsaturated. There's monounsaturated, which probably means what? One. And poly, which means more than one. So you've heard of polyunsaturated fats, right? And mono. So what happens is, think about 2 carbons coming together. Remember we talked about they're sharing a bond? Mm-hmm. Well, if they don't have that one of those bonds free sticking up, those also can form together to form what's called a double bond. So now part of that carbon chain where there's a lot of single bonds connecting some of the carbons, but then in the chain, there's one or more double bonds in there.
It's starting to sound like an OxyClean ad.
Yeah, it does. Matter of fact, that's a really good segue, because I'm going to talk about the problem with unsaturated.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's perfect, because you use the word oxy. And so where single bonds in saturated fat are very resistant to, remember, because what they are is they're sharing electrons. They're very resistant to what's called oxidation, something coming in and stealing an electron. Okay, that's what oxidation means. Leaving sometimes an unpaired electron. So in chemistry, an unpaired electron is highly unstable. It always wants to pair up with something to be stable. When it's not, it forms something called a free radical. You guys have probably heard that term, right?
Pretty good band, right?
Yeah, the free radicals. So when you have a electron that's unpaired that's been oxidized, it runs around and does the same thing to other molecules. So it can form this chain reaction, these free radicals, like dominoes falling, producing just one's oxidizing another, then it will go in turn and oxidize something else, trying to steal electrons, and it causes damage to a bunch of things. And that's what's called oxidative stress. If you remember us talking about back in the stress lecture, chronic disease was caused by two main processes: low level of inflammation, and remember I said chronic oxidative stress. This is a source of oxidative stress. In other words, the body has those antioxidant mechanisms we've talked about before to kind of scarf some of these up. But if it overwhelms the system, that's what's called oxidative stress, and it can cause things like DNA damage, damage to cell membranes, all these really important things.
So how did we get here?
I'll tell you how we got there. Because unsaturated fats, that double bond, are vulnerable electrons.
Okay.
A single bond is pretty stable. A double bond, the electrons that form the double bond are easier to pick off.
Okay.
Okay? And so they're targets for
unsaturated
Yep.
are bad.
No.
Okay.
This is a problem. We can't say good or bad, but I will tell you some of the potential problems with them. Let's talk about monounsaturated. Now that we know what unsaturated means, it just means it has at least one double bond in it. And oh, by the way, when you put a double bond in that chain, it puts a kink in it. Think about, if we go back to a saturated fat, it has single bonds linking the carbons together. They're very, very, they can be bent really easily and kind of fit together. You notice that most saturated fats at room temperature are solid. If you look at coconut oil, put it on the counter, right? You heat it up a little bit above room temperature, it liquefies. But most of them at room temperature are solid. Animal fats, lard, stuff like that, right? It's because they can form it's like a bundle of sticks. If they're all very, very straight and don't have kinks in them, you can make them very tightly compacted. But if you put a bend in a couple of those sticks, you can't pack them together as much. And so that's why some of these poly and monounsaturated fats, because of the kink that the double bond puts in the chain, they're pushed farther apart and they're liquid at room temperature. And that's why. Okay. Now, we know what unsaturated means. So let's move on to the first one, monounsaturated. Here, olive oil is a perfect example. It's called oleic acid. So it's a long, I think oleic acid's 18 carbons. I'll have to look it up to make sure. But it has one double bond in there. And it does have a lot of health benefits. We hear olive oil. It is not a bad fat. And that's the one that's always said is heart healthy. Okay. And you always hear that all the time. But, by the way, steak has a good half of it is that. Is a monounsaturated. So, that's where people think that, like steak is just filled, that's just a big saturated fat bomb.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, they just say saturated fat. Like that's
the only fat.
Yeah.
And so then it also has monounsaturated fat and it has polyunsaturated fat. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But anyway, so now you know but that monounsaturated fat that has that one double bond is susceptible to oxidation. If you ever notice an olive oil bottle, it's usually the good ones are dark. They're not just clear. They do that because there's something called photooxidation where light comes in. It actually can cleave that double bond and actually cause an oxidation reaction. So that's there to protect it. And sometimes they also add in other antioxidants to kind of scarf that stuff up to protect it. The monounsaturated fats, you can cook with them, but heat also will oxidize that double bond and produce a free radical. So I always, for cooking, that's why, people are like, animal fats, a lot of that have more saturated component or coconut oil or something like that is a lot more stable because they're not going to get oxidized by the heat as much, if that makes sense so far.
Yeah.
Okay. But that one double bond usually is okay. I mean, especially if you keep it out of the sunlight and don't have it in hot temperatures, it's not that much. Now, if you get a lot of double bonds in the system, which is called a polyunsaturated fat, and the most common ones we hear about, you've heard of omega-3s in fish oil, right? Have you heard of omega-6?
I think so.
Okay. What does that mean, omega?
The alpha.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And so
Shout out to Twister.
We've taken that terminology. The head of a saturated fatty or not saturated fatty acid, a fatty acid in general, actually has two oxygens hooked up to it on its head. And that carbon that those two oxygens are hooked up to is called the alpha end. The omega is the other end. Okay, so the alpha and the omega, depending on what, if it's in an 18 carbon fat, the alpha is that head, the omega is that 18th carbon at the end. Omega-3 means 3 carbons in from that omega end is our first double bond. That's all that means.
Okay.
Whereas an omega-6 is the first double bond is 6 carbons in from that omega end. Okay. But if you have a bunch of double bonds, what are they susceptible to? Oxidation.
Yes.
Right. You hear about fats going rancid, right? You don't keep vegetable oils and stuff like that they don't have a long shelf life. What does shelf life mean?
It's time.
Hanging out. Before it's oxidized is what that really means chemically. Can you imagine having a fat like that and then importing it into your body? You're basically importing a bunch of free radicals in, okay? What's interesting is the recommendations they're making here is replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats and from vegetable oils. So, Olivia, how are vegetable oils made? They're made from what are we talking about? Soybeans, the different seeds, right?
Oh, yeah.
So talk a little bit about that because I know you looked into it.
Oh, the different ones?
No, just talk about just in general how, because you were talking about earlier, you've looked into it of how, I'm putting you on the spot here, on how they're extracted. Can you imagine getting a seed and getting oil out of it? Yeah. It seems very difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So how do they do that?
Well, okay, so there's different ways.
What's the most common industrial way that they do that for all the processed food and stuff we make and all the oils?
Use solvents.
That's right. They use solvents, usually hexane.
On the solvent or on the seed?
On the seed, right. So they smash it up and then they try to extract the oil with hexane. Hexane is what's called a non-polar solvent, and all that means is it will bind very readily with other things like fats. They like fats, and they will pull them along with them to extract it. What do they do then?
Oh, I need to look.
I put her on the spot. She was just telling me the whole thing, so I thought she had it.
I know. I had it up, and then...
You had it in your brain.
The bottom line is, what else do they use? After it's dried, they use sodium hydroxide usually, right? Which is a very caustic chemical.
Oh, here it is. Okay.
Look
they use hexane solvent. Then they'll do a wash of sodium hydroxide. Which is apparently a caustic, corrosive industrial cleaning agent.
Yep. So Drano is at the very end of that. Drano is like a potassium hydroxide or a large sodium hydroxide. Yeah. So
that stuff works good.
Yeah, it does work good, but they're using that on these things you're eating. Go ahead.
And then they will use phospholipids, some sort of gum, like I don't know how to say that. Free fatty acids, color pigments, and fine meal particles to make it shelf stable. And then they will bleach it. They use bleach to lighten the cloudy color of the processed oil. And steam injection is applied to remove the bitter smell.
So we have lots of heat.
Yeah.
Solvent extraction, all these things, in a polyunsaturated fat. What do you think's and they're trying to add things to make it not oxidize as much, but you're using that stuff is, you know, being recommended to replace, you know, your saturated fat. And what I'm going to show you guys, especially next week, are the downstream consequences of that.
Does our body naturally make vegetable oil?
No. So we have I'm going to get to this. This is an important point too. There are what we call essential fatty acids. That means our body cannot make them. Just like essential amino acids we've heard about. Essential fatty acids are things, and they're omega-3s and 6s that we can't make, that we actually do need, but in very small amounts. Not the amounts they're talking about here, not from the sources, these highly processed sources they're talking about here, where those oils can be oxidized and they're terrible for you because of the free radical formation. What happens, and they also get deposited in your fat tissue and also in the carriers of cholesterol, lipoproteins. So there's a real interesting paper. See if I have it up here. I want to quote it. Go ahead.
So these seed oils, it might have dropped on the ground.
It
too.
might have.
Seed oils, vegetable oils. Okay. So they're using this process for both of them.
Yep.
It sounds like, where they're just dipping or washing them in all these acids and
they're extracting them. Right.
Okay.
So, and they're telling you to basically use, replace, these highly processed things and put those in your diet instead of things like animal fats.
How would you replace, if you're getting your saturated fats from, let's say, animal protein, what's the recommendation? Like, how do you replace it? What has vegetable oil besides like Impossible burgers?
Well, a lot of the processed food are, they want you to cook with this stuff basically, right? How else would you do it? You look at like Crisco and stuff like that, all these vegetable oils that people want to, that they're thinking they're doing good.
Avocado oil, because I think we have some.
It's a little different.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it depends on how you got to look at the extraction process. Olive oil, avocado oil. Avocado has a lot of monounsaturated. It's a lot less, prone to oxidation. But anyway, I'll get to that paper in a minute. But what it showed is that, people that have high intakes of these omega-6 is what type of these seed oils have a huge amount of omega-6. And before I get too far into that, I want to emphasize we need both omega-3 and omega-6 in our diet, but in very small amounts, probably 5 to 7% of our calories, because they're very useful in the inflammatory process and in controlling inflammation. We need them both. We need those there for when we do need an inflammatory process, like during an injury. They're used as precursors to these things called prostaglandins. And other type of molecules are pro-inflammatory. As a matter of fact, ibuprofen's main job is to inhibit prostaglandin. That's why it's an anti-inflammatory. Okay. So I'm throwing a lot of stuff out here, but my point is you need some omega-6s, but you need it in balance with omega-3s. They always talk about, there's a lot of papers talking about the balance between omega-3 and 6s. We should probably have like a 2-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in our diets naturally.
What can we get those from naturally?
Yeah, so nuts, and there are all kinds of stuff. Meat, they all have that in there. Meat has everything. It has saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. And the more...
I'm saying the omegas.
Yeah. So omegas are polyunsaturated. Okay. So omega-6s, you can get them from, meat, nuts, a bunch of different things. But when you load them up in an oxidized form in a large amount, we end up showing what the modern diet looks like. Instead of a 2-to-1 ratio, we have like a 20-to-1 ratio. So we have, for every one omega-3, we have 20 omega-6s, and it tilts the balance to pro-inflammatory. We don't have enough. The omega-3s are precursors to make anti-inflammatory things, so they balance each other out. Okay, And so we talk about that all the time, looking at not only diabetes, cancer, heart disease. There's been a lot of research showing how the balance of that really does predict some of these things. So if you have way imbalanced to have a very high omega-6 versus your omega-3, you're in a pro-inflammatory state because you have all the precursors to make the inflammatory stuff and you have very little to make the anti-inflammatory stuff.
So they want us to cook with these kind of vegetable oils
Yeah.
and all that. And so
Which is insane.
when we're maybe cooking quality foods,
Yeah.
we're just dousing it and cooking it in dog poo-poo.
Pretty much. So you're basically, you're taking something already that has a bunch of double bonds that, because of the way they are processed already many of them are oxidized. Then you're putting it in heat, oxidizing it further. And so you're basically putting a bunch of free radicals into the system that your body has to deal with. It's a huge stress.
Food, and now you're taking it.
And those fats themselves then will become part of your cell membranes and all other things and be stored that way. So when you're making these, when you're looking at the inflammatory process, you got a ton of these pro-inflammatory things and not enough of the anti-inflammatory things. That's why people...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's why fish oil, people are like, oh, you got to supplement fish oil. It's like, well, would you have to? If you had more of a balance. And if you eat real food, you end up looking pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Especially if you eat, fatty fish and stuff like that.
Supplementation isn't necessary.
Yeah, typically, unless you have something you're specifically trying to do. Now, to that end, omega-3s are still, just because they have anti-inflammatory properties in the body, they're still polyunsaturated fats with the double bonds. So you can go to, a big chain store that has this, here's your fish oil on this counter, and who knows how it was transported. Was it temperature controlled? Those things can get oxidized too. It doesn't mean they're good because it says, oh, fish oil here. So if you look at the good fish oil, they're put in, they already have antioxidant. They usually have a little bit of vitamin E in there or something to keep the oxidation down. They're also stored in bottles that are closed off to the sun. And also the recommendation is you should refrigerate them, or I freeze them.
I was going to say that's why Olivia has ours in the fridge.
The freezer is even better for the liquid, but for if you get the capsules, I put those in the freezer.
I weigh the liquid one.
Yeah, you keep that in the fridge.
What was your question, Liv?
Well, my sister is actually starting to learn about seed oils and stuff like that. But one of the things that she has learned is how harmful it is to like your mitochondria.
Yes, exactly, for the same reasons.
Yeah.
So again, remember, the mitochondria in general, puts off, just by functioning, the factory producing energy will promote some free radical formation. But usually our body has enough ample antioxidant defense mechanisms to really take care of that. Because we're utilizing oxygen. It's an oxidative process, right? And we're doing a bunch of oxidation reduction reactions. You don't have to know this, but it's a big chemical soup, and it does produce some free radicals. If you have a whole bunch of these omega-6s in your diet, you're basically overwhelming your body's antioxidant defense mechanisms. The free radicals can absolutely, because the mitochondria is also walled off with the membrane. It can do all kinds of damage there. So, and more importantly, we're throwing off the omega-3/6 balance. We can line this up, and give you all the evidence against why you shouldn't do this. But
is it something where, okay, let's say you eat pretty clean, at least, some natural, stuff. You don't eat a lot of processed food, but it's Friday night and you're feeling like you look cute. So you're going to go out and have yourself some processed food.
Yep.
And is it possible to kind of predict that and be like, okay, I'm going to take some supplement for omega-3s because I know I'm about to take in some free radicals right now?
Or a higher amounts of omega-6.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how important that is, because that's a good question. But they're stored in cell membranes over time. It really has to do with your overall eating patterns over time.
Yeah.
So that one big dump, unless you're guzzling omega-6s directly in
a
oil.
moderation thing, basically.
Yeah, because Yeah, and if you're eating processed food all the time, you're basically just packing your body full of a ton of omega-6 polyunsaturated fats that are getting oxidized and having all kinds of problems. That's your standard now. That's the standard, okay. Right? So no, you wouldn't have to worry about that. Olivia, can you do me a solid real quick? Could you grab that paper that fell on the floor? I'm sorry to have you. I don't want to just step out the.
So those you don't have to think of. I guess that's just the promotion for eating, having your standard diet or your standard nutritional intake be quality rather than and keeping the processed foods to I won't even say a minimum, but
I want to go on a rant.
Not the average, like that's the less than average.
Yes,
Olivia, go ahead.
All I want to say is that to answer your question, and I'm sure Chris is going to talk on this later, but literally everything has those oils in it.
Yep.
You go to Whole Foods or Sprouts, or you think you're going to some really, like, oh, everything here is healthy. The majority of the packaged items that you pull off the shelf is going to have a seed oil in it, and they always ruin it. They're like, here's an organic almond, flour product.
Such a good point.
And then they use sunflower oil. You're like, why are you doing this?
So I promoted this episode to a couple people.
Yeah.
Saying we will kind of help them read the back label of foods and not necessarily literally how to break it down, because it can be confusing, especially when it says organic this and blah, blah, this and this, and it's at Whole Foods. So you anticipate it's going to be a quality item.
And it's just safe to assume that if you go to a restaurant, it's going to be
cooked
a vegetable oil because it is cheap.
That's right.
And it is subsidized.
Let alone the ones that promote that it's
corn.
made in vegetable oil.
Since
like the one we
can you guys also the biggest one that I think is the biggest problem is that canola oil. You guys want to talk about that a little bit?
Please.
We do.
Okay.
We do.
So you always hear, Olivia, you even sent me a little link that had an advertisement on this food that says, "Oh, it's made with heart healthy canola oil," right?
The menu at the restaurant.
The menu at the restaurant.
We care about our customers.
Yeah. So, do you know what a canola is?
It sounds like a nut to me.
Yeah.
Some sort of like a coconut.
It does, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It isn't. So, Olivia, what is canola oil made of?
Oh, the seed?
Yeah.
What's it called? It's called rapeseed.
Rapeseed. That's not the most wonderful sounding thing to advertise. It's like made with
jokes.
Organic rapeseed oil, right?
I promised I would not make a joke.
So rapeseed, it does. The reason why they say it's healthy, the oil itself does have a larger amount of monounsaturated fats in it, but the way it's processed to get it out is horrific. Canola oil it means Canadian oil low acid. That's what canola stands for.
Goodness.
Okay. The acid in there is called erucic acid, and it's a horrendous smelling and tasting substance. So the processing, and you guys can look this up on YouTube, look at processing of canola oil, what they have to do. It's the solvent extraction and all that. And they have to add other stuff to reduce that acid content because it tastes so horrible. It's highly, highly processed. And so any of those double bonds in there,
what's the benefit of cooking with canola oil?
There isn't one.
Well, why? Okay. Counter to that.
Counter to what?
What you just said, that there isn't. Why would a restaurant have on their menu, we care about our customers, we cook with canola oil? My favorite Mexican restaurant.
They don't know. Okay. That's the first one.
Okay.
They just don't know. They bought in because let me tell you, just like saturated fat on the other way, they have very good marketing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of money in this stuff. You can produce a whole bunch of this stuff from the rapeseed, and it's cheaper for them to buy. Okay. And if they can, and if the official guidance says, "Oh, it's heart healthy," they can just hang their shingle on that without looking into it any further. And many of them don't. People that have really studied this stuff look at it and say, "Oh, that's not." But it's another way of just saying, look, and they may be doing it with good intention, saying, hey, look, we're actually using this oil that we think is healthy. They may just not understand that.
So is canola oil like, let's put it in my terms, like the Genghis Khan of oils? So we're talking top 5 bad guys in existence.
Soybean probably first.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to go down the okay.
It's all the seed oils are in there. You could make an argument. I would say that
soybean we're going to put probably at the top.
Well, it's just so ubiquitous. In other words, it's all over the place.
Canola oil's right up there. Like it's
so it's safflower, sunflower, all these polyunsaturated oils that are extracted with solvents and high heat.
So these things, the ones you just mentioned, sunflower, safflower,
they're seeds.
Canola.
Yep.
What was the first one?
Soybean. There's also cottonseed, peanut oil.
Peanut oil. Okay, so I see peanut oil and soybean oil the most at these healthy
corn oil
places.
Yeah.
Like Whole Foods. Like when we think we're gonna buy like a nice gluten-free cracker.
Right.
And it's made. It has that stuff.
Of course it does. Soybeans are the biggest monocrop in the United States. I mean, it is a massive industry, and they put it in everything.
Okay.
So those are
going to be things when someone looks at the back of something, if they're really trying to like help their system and eat cleaner.
I have a guy I work with. He's hilarious. He loves to snack on stuff. He goes, look, I got a really good thing, but I'm not going to show it to Hardy because he's going to rip it apart. And I snatch it from him. I'm like, yep. Soybean oil. It's always something, anything processed. It's very rare to find something that doesn't have the stuff in there. And that's why things in a wrapper usually aren't good. For the most, anyway, I'm just being, as a generality, but when you start reading down that stuff, it's not food.
Okay. Back to the canola oil thing for a second. So your answer to why would this restaurant or in plenty of places say, like, promote that we cook with this, and why are they cooking with this? It comes down to maybe some ignorance because they just follow whatever this report is from the Health Association or whatever, but also cost.
Yep, both. And if they can think, hey, we're doing something healthy, or maybe it's a little more than the other vegetable oil. So we're going to spend a little bit more for the canola oil, just a little bit more, and because it's healthy. It's
been promoted by these.
Yes, it's all variations of bad. Okay, and that's why fried food's so terrible for you, because they fry it in this stuff. They fry it in, it's delicious, but they fry it in these polyunsaturated vegetable oils at high temperatures. You can imagine the oxidation that's taking place there. And you're importing these massive amounts of free radicals into your body.
So let's say you cook with it, like a fried place.
Yep. Like a deep fryer, fat fryer. Yeah, that's what's in it.
They dip that bad boy in that oil.
And who knows how long that oil's been.
Yep.
That was going to be my question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Is because she will yell at me sometimes because I love me some fried food.
Yep.
And she'll bring up that there's actually... it gets worse the longer they use it and don't recycle it.
Yep.
And it's kind of known, I guess. I didn't know this.
Well, it's rancid. All they know is it's going bad.
But they won't change it for like a week, 2 weeks.
Yeah, and because it's cost saving. Right? And restaurants are, a lot of them are just hanging by the skin of their teeth lately, financially.
Yeah.
Yeah, have you ever had a donut where you're like, oh, this actually kind of tastes like burnt oil?
Yeah. So rancid and burnt oil, that's an oxidative process. And so that's what you're eating, just so you know. And if you know that and say, I don't care, that's fine. Just know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I really think most of these restaurants, it is just ignorance.
And I think we already touched on this, but let me just bring it back a little bit. What would be the other option? I mean, I think you said lard and something else. What could a restaurant cook with? What could we cook with at home instead of?
You could cook in a saturated fat,
which is like,
in animal fat, coconut oil, things like that. The problem is none of that stuff's great for you. Doing that stuff at high heat like that.
I've never heard of a restaurant putting out there like, hey, we cook in animal fats.
No, they won't because it's expensive as heck.
Didn't McDonald's
You got to get that.
to?
Huh?
Didn't McDonald's used to?
I have no idea.
Oh, I think that was the thing in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
They switched from
Mm-hmm.
better cooking fats and switched their fries to the stuff that they soy whatever.
Yeah.
And it's obviously the correlation thing, but if you look at obesity in America,
Mm-hmm.
it skyrockets very shortly
Mm-hmm.
after all the McDonald's switched to using
Yeah.
those for their fries.
It's definitely a factor in all this stuff. It disrupts so much of our physiology and makes us basically chronic inflammatory type beings running around with all these high oxidized omega-6s.
Andrew sent me a video of him eating 3 double cheeseburgers.
Yeah.
3. Do we need to call like CPS?
On himself?
Yeah.
Is he a child? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's not a joke. But, do we need to worry about him?
No, because Andrew eats pretty well most of the time. At least what he's told me.
Oh, okay. Well, that's it.
Okay, so you're going to call BS on that?
The guy messages me.
Okay.
Video messages me when he makes his Mimos order, which is burritos.
What you guys do in the privacy of your own homes by yourself is you're
Touché.
consenting adults.
Do you want to see the video he sent me? Please.
Okay.
Go ahead and talk, and I'll bring up the video.
Oh, should I just keep talking?
He's going to be very embarrassed.
Oh, well, that's good to do this on a national,
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be really happy about this.
He said, can you go to that?
I am.
Is it in focus?
Yeah.
So are these two dudes working out?
They're working out pretty hard, too.
Okay.
He sent me this and said, why don't you support me like these guys do?
With working out or with what?
Look how excited they are for each other.
Yeah.
And he wants me to be that excited for him. Look how pumped he is. He sent me this.
Excited about for what though?
Just to be there
in general?
and support him.
For his eating habits or?
No, just in life.
Oh, okay.
And he said, why don't you get that hyped for me, bro? And I said, I do, bro. I totally do, bro. And then he said, you didn't last night is all I'm saying.
Hey, Olivia, it sounds like something that
This is real. Look what I sent him. I sent him a
Brokeback Mountain. So that's for something that you and Olivia and Amy and Andrew maybe to talk about. Wow.
I was not privy to this conversation.
Yeah.
Because
And
it's fresh. It just happened.
Right now?
It happened at 11:44 a.m.
I wish that I was never privy to it.
My body, my choice.
Okay.
So, canola oil.
So you interrupted my thought for that.
I did.
Okay.
You are here.
Okay. So, yeah. So, we've kind of beaten that. You get the idea,
thing,
right?
yeah.
Or any of the vegetable oils, what we're actually doing with that stuff. So kind of, let's backtrack to some of the things. Like we were at lunch after training last weekend. One of my really good friends that I train with that I think the world of, he was telling me he was eating a steak and a family member, not an immediate family member, but a family member was over and was giving him the third degree about that steak. Said, you're going to kill yourself with the saturated fat. Okay. And I'm saying that not to come down on anybody because it's very common because they've done such a good job with this that it's in like the culture. Everyone knows that cholesterol and saturated fat are bad.
We have family members that are highly educated. And
I forgive a lot of people for doing that. But what I always ask people when they say that to me, I'm like, well, why do you believe that? And that's the big question. So why do they say it's bad? And every single, including this dietary guidelines, what they're referencing, is all of them say the reason why it's bad is because it raises LDL cholesterol, which means that that's going to give people heart disease. The problem with that is, in which I'm going to make some statements here that I'm going to back up fully next week, because we don't have time to go into them to the degree they need to, that it is a very bad marker, LDL cholesterol. If you followed any of what we call lipidology, which is the science of studying, fat and cholesterol in the diet and in the body, that it is not a good marker for risk of future heart disease, and which I'm going to discuss why that is extensively next week. So, but that's the entire argument. So their entire argument is based on something that doesn't even cause it. Okay. Saturated fat can transiently, when you eat it, it can raise cholesterol, but it also, and by the way, the good versus bad cholesterol is a bunch of nonsense. There's no such thing.
That's
and
we're
going to talk about, well, it's a tease for next week. But it raises both so-called good and bad cholesterol transiently. And it actually does some favorable things for our lipid profile, which we're going to talk a bunch about. So, Olivia, if you can take a couple notes and make sure I address the saturated fat thing with the cholesterol lecture.
So who is the one that says that?
Okay.
That has taught these people?
Yes. So if you want to know how this argument got started, there's a 800-page book written by Gary Taubes back in the early 2000s called Good Calories, Bad Calories. Okay. And if you guys have not read that book, I mean, it's lengthy, but I think Nina Techholz, I forgot her name. What if it's all been a big fat lie? I'm pronouncing her last name.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I read her book.
Yeah.
Big Fat Surprise.
Big Fat. Well, her initial article was what if it's all been a big fat lie? That was her original article, and then she made that book. But it kind of expounds on what Gary Taubes says. It shows from the beginning the flawed science that this came up with. It is fascinating.
Okay. Is there an audio version?
There may be.
Okay.
It's lengthy, but I could not lay that out better. It shows you both the corporate, governmental, and everything that went into, and some of the really bad science that came into it, and it kind of stuck. Yeah. And we're slowly turning this around with a bunch of people trying to fight this now, saying this isn't scientifically accurate.
Another big podcasts, obviously, that that have
good
people on the.
Yeah, and it's a masterful book. I mean, he did the public health a great service in writing it, but it tells you why it's become entrenched. Okay, and now people have made it their whole careers about doing these observational studies that will just kind of pick on this stuff. Not to mention the red meat argument, which is going to be a whole nother nutrition lecture we're going to do. Yeah, we're going to do that. So what I want to bring up is there is a really good. What's interesting is to counter this whole thing that this is why saturated fat is bad. There is a really nice paper in the British Medical Journal in 2018 titled Omega-6 Vegetable Oils as a Driver of Coronary Heart Disease, the Oxidized Linoleic Acid Hypothesis. Basically, they're making point by point why it is these vegetable oils, much more as opposed to saturated fat, that is really driving this, and it's very, very good. But basically he lays out basically here's he says the arguments why he's saying linoleic acid reduces the risk of coronary heart disease. They say it reduces total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. They're making this argument. This endpoint has nothing to do with cardiac risk. Where these vegetable oils, what I'm going to tell you guys what happens next week is basically what they do. I've told you already that fats basically get deposited, especially these polyunsaturates, into our cell membranes and also into the carriers of cholesterol called lipoproteins. And the more of those omega-6s you eat, especially the oxidized ones, what I'm going to show you guys next week is they actually then oxidize these carriers of cholesterol, which make them much more prone to lodging in arterial walls and not binding with the receptors they're supposed to bind with and forming plaques. So this guy's laid out 20 points of causative reasons why the omega-6, science-based, not this observational nonsense.
Yeah.
And so people are pushing back into this whole narrative, but it's been there's a whole generation that has grown up with it, that have heard about it since childhood, that you can't tell them any differently. And that's why I'm trying to break this down from a first principles based thing to say, no, this is why. It's not just because Chris said no. Right. And I think it's really important, even though the chemistry is dry and some people are bored with it, but it's really important to go through that stuff. And I'm going to kind of do this type of thing with nutrition with each of the points in these nutrition recommendations that just came out, the 10 of them. Yeah. So we'll have a series of podcasts on that. So the bottom line, I think to summarize, today we talked about, problems with nutritional research and what does it really show us anyway. Yeah. We talked about the whole fat thing is what we really concentrated on today, especially saturated, and the fact that there's many different types with many different actions. The fact that the polyunsaturated omega-6s are really a real problem, the way they're processed, the oxidation, all of that, and that they very well may be something that's driving heart disease. Yeah. Just a real precursor, what we're going to talk about next week, just a little hint, just to kind of throw at people, to tease them a little bit. Sure. Do you know that people that have heart attacks, over 50% have optimum cholesterol levels, according to the guidelines.
Well, cholesterol is what causes heart attacks.
see, right. And it's all this evidence is, from all these different sources is in, and we'll talk about that, that heart disease is multifactorial. It's not just diet. It's a lot of things.
Dietary cholesterol.
The whole dietary cholesterol we're going to talk about that too. We finally made some progress on that. They actually finally said it wasn't a nutrient of concern.
Yeah.
They finally,
that was recent, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was in 2015.
Oh, okay.
I
thought it just came out though.
No, it's the Institute of Medicine finally said that there's no evidence. But they're still pushing it though. Still say, you look at packages, it still says low in cholesterol. It's like, what we're going to show you next week is how important cholesterol is to the body. It's regulated very well by the body. If you take in more, it's going to produce less.
So what about all this stuff? I mean, we didn't even touch on this. All this stuff that says, because I grew up always seeing low fat, this, low fat yogurt, all that. And that's well, you got to get that. Yeah. Is that poo-poo?
Well, it depends on what fat. What is fat? What are we talking about?
Yeah. Right?
Are we talking about natural full-fat dairy that is from grass-fed cows? Are we talking, what quality were we talking about? How was it processed? Was it pasteurized and homogenized and all these things that could have, there's so much involved with just making statements like that. But the whole low-fat thing, it's like, well, if you're talking about low-fat by not as much omega-6 polyunsaturates, probably good.
So where are some places, people are, maybe you've piqued their interest. They want to know more. They want to start doing their own research on nutritional stuff. Mm-hmm. What's a good direction? Who are some people that maybe they can YouTube or Google or something like that?
So far as books, Rob Wolf does a fantastic job. He's had 2 books out. He's great at explaining things. I was talking about Gary Taubes, wrote that kind of seminal work, the Good Calories, Bad Calories, which is absolutely fantastic. There's a bunch of them out there that are kind of pushing back against this kind of narrative. But like I said, it's literally been, almost indoctrinated into a whole generation or a couple generations. And it's going to take a while for that to kind of come around. So, nothing is super simple, but when they're making these big statements, and some of them in here that I haven't gotten to that we're going to talk about in later podcasts are just so preposterous that I'm just I can't even believe it. It doesn't even make any sense. So the purpose of this is so people can when someone says something to them, they at least have an understanding of some of the underlying things that, have caused these narratives to take place, and then some of the basic science that says that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Okay.
For sure.
So anyway, I know that's a lot for everyone. We're going to have a very visual podcast next week on cholesterol, because it's a really important topic. And I think because of the visual component, what we'll probably end up doing, especially with what I'm going to lay out, is have a clip for those people that usually listen to audio that can go back and at least watch the really the point, the visual that's going to be really helpful to see.
Okay.
So they don't have to listen to the whole thing over video necessarily.
Right.
And I know the chemistry is kind of difficult to imagine by kind of describing it like what I did today with carbon, but I think you guys got the idea on that,
for
right?
sure. Okay. And at some point, we'll probably end up cutting this one up and putting visuals on the screen.
Sure.
So kind of like Lex Friedman does. So.
Yeah, I think that'd be great, especially some of the visuals. I spent a lot of time working on those visuals. What these fats look like.
Yeah.
Olivia, did you have anything before we kind of wrap up?
There's just so many things.
I know, but anything that we
poignant.
Well, just the fact that when you're talking about Gary Taub's book and like the history, people should Google Ansel Keys.
That's right.
And the 7 country study.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's basically the basis of.
That's exactly right. And then the U.S. Department of Agriculture got involved. There was some really shady stuff that happened in the 70s that he outlines, that they just made some determinations with huge amounts of influence from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I would say that's a conflict of interest for them making any nutritional recommendations.
Mm-hmm. You're reading a book right now, Liv, right? That is on this.
It's on Monsanto.
Mm-hmm.
What was that one called?
Seed Money.
Yeah, Carrie's reading that one too.
Oh, is she reading?
Mm-hmm. But that kind of feeds into the whole monocrop agriculture thing, right? And there's some other statements in this, believe it or not, just other tease some future episodes where they talk about they're bringing, climate change into their food recommendations too.
Interesting. Okay.
Which we're going to talk about as well on that. So there's a lot of good stuff to be kind of getting out of this. Did you have anything, Bill?
I don't. I was just going to drop the whole, if people have questions.
Yeah.
Especially if it in regards to anything nutritional. You can always ask nutrition questions for any episode, and we'll answer it. But as we're coming into this might be a good time to have some questions that are with nutrition.
Oh, there's going to be a ton too, because, I never consider myself an expert in anything. I'm always a student of nutrition perpetually, because you have to be. It's good to kind of understand, because you're going to hear this. Your family member is going to tell you you're killing yourself, and how much saturated fats in breast milk.
Right.
You know what I mean? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It
just comes from being told something your whole life.
That's right, and I understand that.
Well, and you know what? How did we survive? For as long as we have, eating meat and not having vegetable oil, which basically wasn't invented until the 1900s, right?
That's right. And you watch, people typically died of infection, trauma, and stuff like that. And now we're dying of these chronic degenerative diseases. And there's a pretty good correlation with the onset of industrial food.
Yeah.
So.
grapplingwithpodcast@gmail.com, or message any of the social media if you got questions, or send a woof and we'll be good.
Awesome. Thanks for putting up with this one. Hopefully you guys got something out of it.
Yeah. Call Andrew out on his messages.
Wow. I just don't know what to say about that. I gotta tell you. That was it.
So mad. Hit it, honey.